Yeah, actually, like, but then I think like maybe it'll be
Pode mostrar quais são os que estão para. Eu mandei duas versões dos slides.
Foi a que você mandou hoje.
Certo. Aí eu gosto daqui mesmo, é esse mesmo.
Perfeito.
So I Okay, welcome everybody for the last panel of this workshop. And it's a very exciting one, focusing on a range of different topics related to digitalization, cyber diplomacy, AI, datafication, and cryptocurrency. We have four distinguished speakers. The first is Matteo Burzi, who's a researcher in the Rome in the Istituto Affari Internazionale in Rome, specifically in the multilateralism and global governance program of the Institute. He obtained his PhD at the Marco Biaggi Foundation, and he was a research fellow at the Department of Economics at the University of Modena. He also held visiting positions at the University College of Dublin and the Economic Governance and EMU Scrutiny Unit of the European Parliament. His research has mainly focused on the economic governance framework of the European Union, cryptocurrencies, and central bank digital currency. Then we have, to my left, Rafael Mesquita. He's an assistant professor of international relations at the political science department of the Federal University of Pernambuco, here in Brazil. And he's the coordinator of the research program Multilateralism and Global Challenges, Past, Present, and Future. He holds a PhD in political science from the Federal University of Pernambuco. He has also been a visiting scholar at Columbia, Oxford, and the German Institute of Global and Area Studies. His research has focused on the ground-up construction of original data sets in a range of different areas of international politics where we lack data. Then we have Isabel Sequeira. She's the director of at the Institute of International Relations here at PUC-Rio, and a researcher at the BRICS Policy Center. She holds a PhD in International Relations from King's College London. She founded the Critical Approaches to Development Network, co-coordinates the Security and Development in the Global South research line at the BRICS Policy Center, and co-founded the Digital Humanities Laboratory at PUC-Rio. Her research areas include international development and cooperation, the intersection between peace and development, Agenda 2030, Data and Policies on Development, Feminist and Southern Contributions to Rethinking Data Policy, and its impact on solidarity, responsibility, and coexistence. And then we have Luisa Lobato, who is a professor at PUC-Rio and coordinator of the Digital Humanities Laboratory at PUC-Rio. She holds a doctorate in international relations from PUC-Rio, and she has experience in a range of areas focusing on cybersecurity, algorithmic security, predictive policing and the politics of technology, with an emphasis on topics such as the role of digital technologies in security governance, the imaginary surrounding them, their processes of securitization and militarization, and their impact on democracy. My name is Mirko Hensel. I'm a assistant professor at Maastricht. And without further ado, let's start with the first presentation by Matteo Bussi. Everybody has 15 minutes. Thank you, everyone. Today I'm going to present a research report that I wrote with my colleague at the Great from the International. A research report related to the multilateral regulation of cryptocurrency. But before talking about the action implemented by multilateral institutions regarding crypto, I think it's important to underline what are the main risks related to this sector. First of all, illegal activities. Since the inception of the crypto phenomenon, crypto has been largely used by criminals in order to carry out their activities. That's due to two main reasons. First one, crypto grabs an important level of anonymity with users. Second, the crypto operates outside the traditional checks of the traditional financial system. Then we have the second risk, financial stability. An unregulated crypto sector which continues to attract an increasing amount of money represents a huge risk to financial stability. A risk which becomes particularly tangible when we think, for example, about the possible bank exposure to crypto, and when we think about the way in which stablecoin issuers could handle their research. Then we have the third problem, which is quite important, environment. Right now, many important cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin continue to operate on the basis of the proof of work mechanism. The proof of work mechanism requires an important energy consumption, which becomes bigger day after day. Keep in mind that currently the energy consumption related to Bitcoin is higher than the one related to countries like Austria or Finland. So we're talking about something. In light of this risk, in the past 12 years, I have to say, the observability, multilateral fora has something remarkable. In our report, we have taken into account the action implemented by previous protocol. I'm talking about the Financial Stability Board, the Financial Excellence Board, and the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. What kind of institutions are the three multilateral boards? Well, usually scholars say that this institution operate like clubs. They operate like clubs because they include a limited number of countries. Because in order to be included in this institution, they have to be accepted by all the members of this institution. And because they operate with a high level of confidentiality, it's almost impossible to know what is the precise position adopted by a country during the deliberative process. Likewise, we do not have minutes of the meeting. This free multilateral institution adopt decisions through the consensus mechanism. So, an act in order to be adopted has to reach the consensus of all the members. Furthermore, the free multilateral fora do not issue hard law instruments. They do not issue treaties. They issue soft law instruments like recommendations, for example. According to this two last element, the one who the fact that the decision adopted represented low profile compromises, or that there could be a low level of compliance. This is not the case of this institution. Historically, this institution were capable of touching the heart of the problem, to go in the details. And historically, in particular, talking about the Basel Committee, there was an important level of compliance. Okay. So, what kind of rules have this institution adopted regarding it? Well, the Financial Stability Board has adopted 9 recommendations on crypto assets, and then 10 specific recommendations on global stablecoin. In the past 5-6 years, global stablecoin has become a huge concern for regulators. Then we have the Financial Excellence Board. The Financial Excellence Board works on anti-money laundering, on terrorism financing. In this slide, the Financial Excellence Board has revised its recommendation number 15 in order to incorporate within its rules virtual assets like cryptocurrencies. Then we have the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. Well, the Basel Committee has adopted the most pervasive rules regarding crypto.
The Basel Committee has issued standard, prudential standard on bank exposure to the crypto sector. This standard should enter into force starting from 1st January 2026, even if some nations have already done something on this. So what is the philosophy behind these rules? It is more than reasonable to say that until November 2024, the most important economic nation of the world shared a skeptical view of crypto. So they were concerned about financial stability, environment, consumer protection, and about monetary sovereignty. So in this regard, it is not surprising that the rules adopted reflect this skepticism, this negative stance. So in a certain way, the rules adopted want to limit or show the expansion of this sector. So, having said this, what is the position adopted by the most important economic blocs of the world? Talking about the European Union, US, and China. And they followed the rules adopted on a multilateral basis or not? Well, the scenario is fragmented. Let's start with China. China continues to be really anti-crypto. The Chinese government is quite skeptical regarding crypto for financial stability concern, but in particular because they see crypto as a possible way in which private actors take an important role within Chinese economy. In this regard, the Chinese government has gone even a step further than the rules adopted by multilateral institutions. They did not regulate crypto, they banned all crypto-related activities within their territory. This decision dates back to 2021. At the same time, China has invested massively on its central bank digital currency, digital renminbi. When we talk about China, however, we have to keep in mind that there is also Hong Kong. If it is true that China has banned all the crypto-related activity within its territory, at the same time, it is true that Hong Kong has become one of the most important crypto financial hubs of the world. This seems to be a paradox. According to many observers, this is due to the will of the Chinese government to maintain a foot within the crypto sector in order to see how it will evolve. So Hong Kong represents a controlled environment in which crypto can continue to operate. And if the crypto sector will become something different, then China could exploit the Hong Kong experience. Then we have the European Union. Well, the institution, so I'm talking about the European Commission, European Central Bank, but I'm also talking about the European government, continue to have a negative view, skeptical view of crypto. But they not followed the Chinese experiment, the Chinese experience. They have decided to regulate the phenomenon, following the rules adopted on a multilateral basis. So in this regard, the EU has redefined its rules regarding anti-money laundering. The EU has changed the regulation regarding bank exposure to crypto. And in particular, the EU has adopted the MiCA regulation, market and crypto asset regulation. With MiCA regulation, the EU has created a comprehensive and adopted regulatory framework regarding stablecoin. And in designing MiCA regulation, the EU has followed the rules, the recommendation of the financial stability. At the same time, the EU has invested in its central bank digital currency, the digital euro. Then we have the US. Well, the first Trump administration and the Biden administration were quite skeptical regarding crypto. They saw crypto as a threat to financial stability, and they saw crypto as a potential threat toward the global role of dollar. The Biden administration has appointed several individuals to crypto, I would say, skeptical crypto individuals to lead the most important financial institution of the US. Likewise, the Biden administration has led the effort of the multilateral organization that we have analyzed in order to define the rules that I just talked about. So the Biden administration, in a certain way, has led the efforts toward a regulation which is really careful regarding crypto. However, under Biden, the US were not capable of adopting a comprehensive regulatory framework regarding crypto. Then we have again Trump's re-election, and the situation changes dramatically. Under the first presidency, Trump was anti-crypto. Then something changed. Trump became an important crypto investor. Likewise, important figures of his administration, like, for example, our Lutnick, is the Secretary of Commerce, are important crypto investors. In this regard, it is not surprising that US has become a crypto nation. Trump has appointed a pro-crypto figure to lead, for example, the Security and Exchange Commission. Trump has talked about the possibility to constitute a Bitcoin Federal Reserve. And the US, under Trump, have adopted the Genius Act. The Genius Act is a comprehensive regulatory framework related to stablecoin. To a certain extent, it follows the recommendation that it was called the Financial Stability Board, but it's much more lenient than the MiCA regulation. The MiCA regulation is careful to for stablecoin. The Genius Act instead is pro-crypto, for stablecoin. Okay. In this moment, it appears almost impossible that the US under Trump will adopt the Basel standard regarding bank exposure to crypto. So, we can say that in this scenario, we are facing a crypto regulation paradox. The United States under Biden have led the effort toward a definition of precise, strict rules on crypto. Right now, they are withdrawing. And I believe that in this sense, it is quite emblematic, this statement of Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary. According to this statement, it appears crystal clear that the US wants to set their own financial rules, period. And this is a huge blow toward the effectiveness and the robustness of this free contractual program. So, I'm concluding with this slide. In our report, we ask ourselves, what should the EU do in this new scenario? Well, two hypotheses, two possible directions. First one, follow the US and become pro-crypto. Other hypothesis, hold the line, maintain its regulation, and remain cautious. So far, it seems that the EU is following the second hypothesis. And it seems that the EU wants to answer to the possible expansion of the crypto sector with the digital euro. The Trump presidency has boosted again the discussion regarding digital euro. Right now, there is an debate regarding the features of the digital euro today, but this is a huge topic that is certainly another segment. So I stop myself here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Maybe too much. Is that better? Can I have this clicker? Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to thank all of the organizers for this opportunity to come here and share a little bit on EU Latin American convergence or divergence on the field of cyber diplomacy. Working? Okay. So, first things first, in order to draw a meaningful comparison between any two entities, such as the EU and Latin American countries, it is necessary first to establish with respect to what are these entities being compared. The difficulty is that the title of the panel, digitalization, is an umbrella term that captures a wide array of processes, and depending on the author you consult, it might refer to a very domestic phenomenon, such as e-government services available to the population, whereas others will point to international processes, such as a country's position in UN negotiations. So given this heterogeneity, I'd rather not tackle digitalization as an undifferentiated single policy area, and take a step back first to disaggregate the broad idea of digitalization, or this intersection between the digital sphere and diplomacy, into three sub-areas: cyber diplomacy, digital diplomacy, and tech diplomacy. So in the first 2 minutes, I'll define these separate tracks prior to delineating an approximate profile of where the EU and Latin America stand on cyber diplomacy in particular, and whether we are seeing growing convergence or divergence in that field. The first track, cyber diplomacy, is defined by authors like Barrinha and Renard as the performance of diplomatic functions to secure national interests with regard to cyberspace. It arises because digitalization is a pervasive process that touches multiple levels of society, and as a result, actors come to acquire specific interests regarding cyberspace, and specific assets that must be defended in cyberspace, as we've just gotten a good example from Mateus' lecture on crypto. Because of international anarchy and the coordination problem that this entails, there's always a possibility that states will do harm to one another, and if this is unresolved, it might lead to escalation. Hence, cyber diplomacy is what states do to one another in order to adjust their coexistence and develop common rules of the digital role. Now, this defense of national interest could be understood in terms closer to cyber defense, or in terms of the norms that states develop so as to defend those interests, in which case it would be closer to what is commonly known as internet governance, a process that plays out in arenas such as the UN group of governmental experts, the open-ended working group, and so forth. The second concept, digital diplomacy, has come predominantly to mean public diplomacy by ministries of foreign affairs using social media, but it pertains more to national foreign policy, communication objectives, than to multilateralism proper. The third neighboring concept, tech diplomacy, is something of a latecomer in the literature. There were publications about cyber and digital diplomacy in the mid-2000s already, and only around 2015, we see consistent interest in the idea of tech diplomacy. But despite this late start, tech diplomacy is today one of the areas that receives most attention because of the rise of AI and the cloud of big tech. The first definition for tech diplomacy came from practitioner, the Danish tech ambassador Kasper Klinger, in a 2017 publication, and several other authors have defined it since then, along the lines of efforts by governments to approach centers of radical technological innovation so as to secure national welfare. This is not a new practice with regard to what states have been doing previously with science diplomacy or export promotion. What is new is the prominent role of big tech as an interlocutor in its own right. So according to a recent estimate, the Magnificent Seven in the US has a combined valuation roughly the size of EU GDP. So, of course, to be reckoned with in international affairs. With those concepts defined, then it is clear, in my view, that cyber diplomacy is the one of greater interest to this panel because, of course, the tagline of the Insured project is on the robustness and legitimacy of multilateral institutions. And also, I would like to mention high praise to the report written by Federica Marconi and Ettore Greco that precisely that's published on the Insured website and tracks precisely this trajectory of where cyber diplomacy negotiations are today since the point of the first World Summit of the Information Society in the early 2000s. Now, that being said, there are, of course, some interesting parallels between EU and Latin America that could be drawn with regards to digital diplomacy and tech diplomacy, of course. Notably, in both regions, we find that major institutions like the European Commission, or in the national case, Brazil, our central bank, our Supreme Court, have displayed a similar preference for playing a heavier hand in regulating and curbing the influence of big tech within their respective markets and public discourse. But that being said, for the rest of the presentation, I'll focus on whether Latin America and the EU have come together in cyber diplomacy, multilateral negotiation proper. My modest contribution to the Insured Expert Network was a post about an article I published with Bruno Teodoro Luciano in Global Policy about what we call the myth of EU-Latin American convergence. There is a common assumption that Europe and Latin America are natural partners for a number of reasons: shared history, culture, common political values such as democracy, multilateralism as a standard way of doing business in international affairs, a preference for the empire of law as opposed to power politics as a key principle in international relations, So the standard idea is that we should be natural partners, which is also the language used by EU institutions in turn. Now, contrary to that image, Bruno and I in the article suggest that this is perhaps an old picture that no longer corresponds to the changing landscape, because hardened by a decade of migratory and now military crisis, the quote-unquote normative power Europe of the 2000s has become the geopolitical Europe of today. At the same time that Latin America, for all its grandstanding on protecting the weak from the hegemony of the strong, has been a fence-sitter regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Hence, there is a growing mismatch between expectations and realities that have taken root in the bi-regional relationship. Now, Bruno and myself in the article demonstrate that this disagreement has been escalating since the mid-2010s. We see that approximately 1 in 3 things that are put to a vote in the UN General Assembly, EU and Latin America no longer agree on. And we also found out that this disagreement is more pronounced in a few areas that are highly relevant in the context of a geopolitical era: human rights and security, as in nuclear and conventional disarmament. So these are the leading areas of disagreement between both regions for the past 10 years or so. And in that context, I find that cyber diplomacy is a promising area of investigation because it touches upon both domains. The key cleavages regarding cyber today pertain to security, so the responsibility, the behavior of states in cyberspace, hybrid warfare, and also to human rights, privacy, digital human rights, and so on. And so it was an interesting test case to see whether this divergence is also present in this emergent policy area. To compare to what extent EU and Latin America converge or diverge in cyber diplomacy, I first compare the similarity of their speeches in UN processes such as the GGE and the OEWG, and then to capture more precisely their security and human rights orientations, I look at their draft sponsorship in the first and third committee of the General Assembly. Now you see there a scaled plot of the speeches in which the rightmost extremity here is very similar speeches to the US, that's one pole, and similar speeches to Russia as the opposite pole. There are 2 interesting takeaways. First, that Europe is unlike any other region in the world for the level of cohesiveness of their speeches on this topic. But what's interesting is that Latin America is not second in line in proximity to Europe. This is the rest of Western countries, Canada, and so on. And Latin America is precisely in the middle of the spectrum between both regions, of course, not taking into account Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which unsurprisingly are very close to Moscow. The second test, a draft sponsorship network. So there we have approximately 90 UN General Assembly resolutions that were tabled at the first committee and the third committee, the first dealing with security, the third with human rights. And what we see, so Latin America is in pink, and Europe is in green. And in both cases, in the first committee, we see the cleavage, and the third committee not as pronounced, but also there is a separation. Latin American positions on the first committee are interesting because it's definitely trying to play both sides. We see that it does not endorse, sponsor the EU-US resolutions on responsible state behavior in outer space. However, it votes for them, whereas Russia and its allies, they vote against it. At the same time, the Latin Americans also vote in favor of the competing Russian resolution that's normally tabled quickly after. So it is a cultivated ambiguity that makes it a bit challenging to predict where the relationship will be heading, as both regions are looking for more reliable partnerships in their efforts towards strategic autonomy. The main conclusion then is that this EU-Latin American convergence also transmits, spills over into the cybersecurity domain, as it has been seen in more broadly in other policy areas under negotiation at the UN. It'll be interesting to monitor how these issues evolve as this weekend representatives from Latin America and Europe will meet in Colombia for the next EU Select Summit. With that, I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafael. Next, we have Isabel.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So, I think first it takes probably psychological analysis that both Louise and I decided to have handwritten notes for our presentations on digitalization. And I think it's the first time for me for some reason. I'm going to talk a little bit about datafication. I've been doing research on data politics and datafication for a while, and I think it's a somewhat transversal topic to what's being discussed here. I think we can take as a point of departure considering the theme of this seminar, the way in which we can think of multilateralism and digitalization, how they relate, to strengthen, safeguard, hold risk, or refrain each other. And in a recent article in preparation for IMF and the World Bank meetings in October, it was said the AI infrastructure and governance framework being built right now will shape development trajectory for decades. Whether the transformation is designed with the global south or merely delivered will depend on decisions being made now on infrastructure, governance, and priorities. AI is not just technology, it is infrastructure, as Louisa will demonstrate. It's computer clusters, energy grids, and network connectivity, assets rooted in specific geographies that determine where value is created and risks accumulate. So I want to focus a little bit on those specific geographies and speak a little bit from the point of view of the global south. There are, however, much inequality within the so-called global south, and that's precisely one of the main points. So China invests heavily in AI capacity from chips to cloud platforms. For instance, India generates roughly 1/5 of the world's data, but on the other hand, holds only about 3% of global data center capacity. And Africa accounts for less than 1% of global data center capacity, despite being home to 18% of the world's population. But infrastructure is not enough, as we are well aware. Enters governance. What frameworks are being developed that can govern AI, digitalization, datafication in general? So in 2024, we had probably one of the most recent demonstrations of a multilateral attempt to govern all of this phenomenon. The UN held the Summit of the Future and launched the Global Digital Compact. This was in the follow-up of initiatives like the establishment of the UN High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. The Global Digital Compact focuses on the governance of AI and digital public infrastructure, and transversally, also the governance of data more broadly. It aims to, first of all, close all digital divides and deliver an inclusive digital economy. Second, build an inclusive, open, safe, and secure digital space. Third, strengthen international data governance and govern AI for humanity. The question I want to raise here is perhaps one that inverts the logic a little bit. How can the governance, inclusive governance, that is, of AI, digital public infrastructure, and data, strengthen multilateralism and reform its institutions making them better equipped to deal with the threats of our times. Again, Teresa will cover most of the topic of the governance of AI, and I want to briefly identify a few signposts of what could be maybe a fair and safe certification, and hence what a fair and safe governance of data could look like. Fair and safe certification needs to be inclusive, participatory, and guided by ethical commitments. So the first key point is that we need to prioritize data literacy in the Global South. And that has been said a lot, but has been done very little. This is key for civil society engagement, accountability processes, and therefore, so that there is a co-design of governance mechanisms instead of mere consultation, and the co-design of technologies themselves. Only this will allow a measure of digital sovereignty to be retained, and I'll come back to this point after. And data literacy means having data stewards as well, human beings that can be placed in the loop to work with AI within digital infrastructures, who remain actively engaged in checking its working, not just signing on what's being done. We also need to frame a fair and safe certification in terms of a rights-based approach, making sure that certification does not reproduce inequality. So data literacy, for instance, can help include those that contribute inclusive thinking when defining the questions that data are supposed to answer. So it's not just about including people in the data themselves, but also including people that are capable of enlarging the scope of the questions being asked and asking better questions out of the data that we are producing. And finally, a fair and safe certification is by definition in opposition to data extractivism or data colonialism. It is more common for countries in the Global South to lack the regulations of adequate digital infrastructure to face the growing demands of the global data market. Hence, we see the potential for further encroachment of the big techs and the problems they may cause. And what we have been witnessing is that the big techs are pouring billions of dollars into building data centers and related infrastructure to govern to allow for the power AI, artificial intelligence. And the consequence has been that the Global South has been relying, and it's going to increasingly relying on the foreign controlled cloud infrastructure, which provides ample access to sensitive data. And we are seeing the dangers of that with the access that is provided to the data on migrants and refugees in different countries in the world. So this is sensitive data that will be stored in foreign controlled cloud infrastructure. Addressing these issues lead to strengthening multilateralism, but by incentivizing consensus building, adherence to a rights-based framework, more coordinated global action, international cooperation for capacity building, transfer of technology that might also lead to more cooperation, especially regional cooperation in the construction of data centers, for instance, but also in investigating and preparing for the ecological impacts of data centers as well, and so on. And so I think those are more open questions so that we can debate from the point of view of the Global South and the strengthening of multilateralism than proper answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And now we have the final speaker, which is Luisa.
Hi, yeah, sure. Everybody, good afternoon. I'm Luisa Lobato, professor here at PUC-Rio. When I was thinking about how I could contribute to the debate, one question was out my head, and so my contribution today will be try to explore a little bit of this question, not answer it, but explore it. And the question is militarism an obstacle to AI government, AI multilateral government? So first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Karen Michael Campbell for the invitation to participate in the discussion. And also perhaps to just say that this interest, this research interest that I have on AI comes from a broader interest on the role of digital technologies in global cybersecurity governance, which has involved research on cybersecurity, predictive policing, or algorithms more general, everyday application, and more recently what we've been calling AI. And in the past decade, and more intensely since the resounding success of generative AI, interest for this topic has skyrocketed. Whether researching machine learning algorithms or in the form of attention to AI systems that learn as they interact, as in the case of Gen AI, or even in the already decade-long debate on autonomous lethal weapon systems, the technologies have become objects of attention within regional and multilateral instances. So my discussion today is going to touch upon this theme. And since at least 2014, the UN has been discussing how to approach lethal autonomous weapon systems, or killer robots, as they call. In 2021, the EU began discussing its AI Act, what is now actually its AI Act, which has been published in 2024. And in Latin America, countries such as Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Mexico have been working on the development and implementation of national AI policies and frameworks. Regional cooperation, on the other hand, has been taking place within, for example, the 2023 Santiago Declaration, then the 2024 Montevideo Declaration, which have called for strengthening the dialogue on AI governance in the area. And finally, the BRICS Summit Declaration of this year includes the declaration on the global governance of AI. In this declaration, the leaders' declaration calls for multilateral action to mitigate the risks posed by these technologies. And this declaration, so my turn is going to be now. This declaration, however, leaves out of consideration, actually, leaves out of the text of the declaration, the military domain. Of course, BRICS is not a military law for cooperation, but also several other of the texts that I've mentioned, with the exception, of course, of lethal autonomous weapon systems, leave the military domain unprovoked, I would say. And they have a hard time finding working consensus, both in regional and multilateral instances. There have been a difficulty in finding this consensus on how to it's not regulate, govern, or find common standards for the use of artificial intelligence in the context of armed conflict on the one hand, but also internally in countries, public security. At the same time, expenditures on military AI or defense AI keep increasing. Estimates suggest an increase from $46 billion in 2022 to $9.2 billion in 2023 worldwide. So this is a worldwide estimate. And the wars on Gaza and in Ukraine have contributed to push these numbers up also in 2024 and possibly now in 2025. And AI as a field holds, as many of you might suspect or know, an intimate relationship with the military sector since its inception. With the first wave of funding, AI funding, coming from the Department of Defense in the US, and in the 60s, and later rising up again in the 90s. And today, what we see is a similar trend that seems to be enforced in the global north. So the idea of a geopolitical Europe makes much sense in the context of these rising costs, rising expenditures in defense and military application. And while in the south, what we have is a fragmented and varied approach among the countries, of course, quite diverse. But what we have is countries like Turkey, India, for example, focusing on developing in-house AI military technologies while also buying from global north countries, also from China. But they want to develop their own capacity, in-house capacities. And on the other hand, we have countries such as the LAC region, Latin American region, focusing more on the, to use an expression that has already appeared here, the empire of law, or in the multilateral arrangements and governance mechanism, and pushing for these mechanisms to advance in multilateral organization. Consensus has been hard to achieve also here. Even in the context when we are discussing regulation, ideas such as, for example, meaningful control, what is meaningful control in the context of military application is not entirely agreed upon, even in UN expert groups on the topic. So these topics that I have raised are aimed to question a specific context that we are witnessing right now. So while military expenditures on AI remain the elephant in the room in multilateral debate, a solid, concerted, and actionable cooperative arrangement will be hard to achieve. So this is more of a final alarm that I think is important to raise with regards to the rise of this new political context where actors that were previously more clearly interested in cooperative arrangement dealing with the defense domain are now turning to a different direction. And of course, my concern in this discussion is that this is a very dangerous path to take. So yeah, thank you so much. This has been my contribution, and I hope that we can discuss a little bit of this further in the comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for really insightful contributions, and also for making my job as the chair really the easiest imaginable. Every single speaker finished multiple minutes before the time was done, which might be a first in my entire academic life. So maybe this leaves a lot of space for audience members to ask questions and engage with the talk. So maybe we open up for a first round of questions.
I wanted to ask a question about the data center governance. I think that is the first presentation where it was mentioned. What kind of pathways do you see, and I mean, what should be the focus of data center governance? More on the standard side, or like connected to climate, or just like what kind of pathways do you see would lead to the most efficient outcome? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take 3 questions at a time. So maybe we go to Clara or.
Thank you all for the panelists for the talk. It was great. My question is more related to what Luis Lovato said, but all of the panelists can chime in if they want. I wanted to ask about the AI mechanisms in conflict and war, especially relating to the question if they really make higher death toll of civilians. And if so, should it be considered as weapons of war that can promote or continue crimes against humanity, especially genocide. And I'm speaking in context, especially of Gaza. It seems to be happening under the Israeli army, especially Unit 8200, that is infamous for using AI technologies and complex algorithmic mechanisms to target and create surveillance of Palestinians, and create targeting mechanisms that seems to disconsider civilian casualties. That's all. Thank you.
I have curiosity. Thanks a lot for a really insightful panel on the topic. I don't know very much about. And I have two questions. One is for Raphael. When you presented on the divergence between the EU and Latin America, I immediately thought about our climate panel yesterday, where we heard a lot of talk about Brazil and Latin American initiatives. It to coincide with what Europe is saying. So I was wondering, I know it's a question in your paper, but do you have an explanation of why Europe and Latin America seem to be growing apart when it comes to multilateral initiatives? And the other question is for Louisa and Vivek, but maybe not too much. Could you end it also more with a normative statement, saying that we need more inclusive data governance, or Louisa pointing out that if the militarization of AI is not addressed, multilateral cooperation is not unlikely to follow through. Yet we know the geopolitical context is probably moving in a different direction. So my question is, what are pathways to this? Which actors are still pushing in this way? How can this be achieved? Can it still be achieved?
Thank you very much. Let's go to some responses by the speakers. And I would suggest we go in the reverse order of the original presentation. So, Louisa can start.
That's a challenge. I just didn't pick up their names, so yeah, sorry. Huh? And so maybe to start with your question. It's often said that we now live at an Oppenheimer moment with regards to AI. And if you've read the book or saw the movie or know Oppenheimer history and the history of nuclear weapons, that means that we have developed the technology at a certain point that it can do serious damage, and that we have to find ways of agreeing of how we can mitigate the risk or the damage that it can produce. The question is, at the same time, you have an economic incentive. AI supposedly reduces the cost of warfare in a sense, but also the human cost of warfare for the part that is attacking. So you can attack at a distance, and this has been discussed in debates around drones and targeted killing. So, and of course, it's going to be always interesting for the parties that are involved, interested in continuing conflict, to adopt and to keep this unregulated. At the same time, we have action at the multilateral stage from countries from the global south that have been pushing for more a clear governance arrangement. This is not, I mean, you have, of course, the campaign that comes in 2014 about banning killer robots, but this is not what has been at the table with regards to military, all the kinds of military AI, because this is a military weapon system. But what has been in discussion is in which context are we allowing this to be used? What role, and the most important question with regards to the debates that are taking place now, is what role do humans must have when it comes to the deployment of these systems? And disagreement upon, which I don't think it's a fundamental disagreement in the sense of understanding what it means, what control means, but more in the sense of leaving companies and governments a little bit more free to use this and deploy the systems in the battlefield. But the question is, how can we make the people, not only the system, but the people that develop these systems accountable? And of course, I cannot provide another answer to the question on how we make how can we make countries find consensus in this, but I think that we can start through or by these smaller points in the regulatory debate. So focus on promoting a shared understanding about meaningful, for example, meaningful human control, which has been the most controversial aspect with regards to this. It is an important first step in my perspective, so we can find a common agreement upon that. But I agree it's completely difficult, specifically now coming to the question that has raised, specifically with regards to an interest which is also being not only an economic interest, but also a more, I mean, again, I'm not sure if you say this was a genocidal interest in the context of, for example, Gaza, but of course we have similar systems we employ in Ukraine. But what I think about the relationship between the implementation of these technologies and war and conflicts, that the discourse, you have a difference between discourse and practice. So in the discourse, AI supposedly makes, or not only AI, but digital technologies more broadly, supposedly makes conflict more precise. You can better target and reduce casualties. This is not what we see in practice, neither in Ukraine, neither in Gaza, which are the most like evident conflict that or textbook cases of AI usage in warfare. What we see is actually two very violent and bloody conflicts that use in which you have the use of AI. The Lavender system in the case of Israel, for example, is supposedly should target specifically individuals related to Hamas, but in fact is actually targeting houses and the houses that neighbor these houses and the people that are inside these houses. So it's not only one person that is going to be targeted, sometimes it's the entire building. So my question is this more precise or not? So the first thing maybe, and to go back to the other question, then maybe we should question is to which extent AI is an interesting technology in the context of military application, or effective if military people like to think in this way. To which extent this is effective. And the investment worth it with regards to the human cost. But yes, I think that we're back to a stage where, like the Second World War, civilians are now again the targets. And Professor Scalesi was talking about this on Wednesday in his speech. These are my two cents. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but a little bit of what I'm thinking.
Thank you very much. I think.
Thank you for the questions. Sorry, didn't catch your name. Michaela, thank you. So start with your question about data centers. And well, I'm more concerned actually with the possibility that they are going to be at the center of the next financial bubble. And that there are many people now talking about that risk because, what analysis shows is that the creativity behind AI industry walks hand in hand with the creativity of the financial solutions that they find to fund all the advances in AI. So for instance, OpenAI has been able to fund a lot of its growth based on a kind of circular kind of funding where a lot of billions of dollars come back and forth, and it's based really on nothing. It's based on the potential of that AI will increasingly deliver. But well, analysis showed that at one point it will not meet this expectation, right? And so there are many indications that this will be the next financial bubble. And at the center of that is the construction of data centers everywhere. And related to the data extractivism, because the new frontiers are in the global south. So they offer millions and millions and billions, for instance, for India, because there's this whole new ground to explore. As I was pointing out, there's a lack of data, and the huge population, the lack of data, there are no data centers, basically no data centers. So what India is trying to do now is perhaps an example. They're trying to avoid being the data supplier and become the governance partner. So they're holding this major conference next year to study the impact of AI, and they want to be the governance partner instead of the data supplier, and not just provide data, right? But these are all models that are being developed and studied as we speak. So there are really no solutions. But what we can say is that because of the ecological impacts and the financial risk, those should be discussed alongside each other. And we shouldn't be just talking about technology behind it, but also, and not just the risks behind it in terms of the technology, but we should also be talking about the ecological impacts and the financial risk. And then that brings me to the second question, and what pathways are there? That's very difficult to answer because, well, we had an example with our experience with the Digital Society Forum. Both Liz and I were engaged with the forum, and there are solutions coming out of those different kind of blocks within the international system and non-hegemonic forces or whatever. But what they provide, I think, is more to do with a common language that offers some kind of leverage, so that the governments in the global south at least have something they can organize around in order to push for a consensus within certain organizations. So, for instance, when we had the Global Digital Compact last year, there was a consensus around elaborating safeguards for digital public infrastructure. So the document was out. There was a consensus for the safeguard around digital public infrastructure because there was a language for that. But for other areas that's more difficult, the themes are more technical, so civil society is hardly engaged, so it's more difficult. So I think those are the pathways, but again, not really an answer.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Rafael.
So with regard to Clara's question, I guess the similarity between the findings of my talk and yesterday's interventions on climate goes to show that this divergence between EU and Latin America is cross-cutting. It can be detected across policy areas. With regards to environment, that would not be very surprising can be framed in a broader global north, global south, predictable sort of division between growth versus conservation. As we heard from the speakers yesterday, a lot of the discursive effort revolves around recentering this debate in a language that's compromised, acceptable enough to both parties. So the climate's conservation versus growth divergence can be seen as just a specific instance of a more standard global north, global south division on this aspect. But on the topics exposed here, maybe there's something more peculiar to that, and I would attribute to the very different security environments both regions have experienced, and that inevitably spills over into what they use multilateralism for. And this, I believe, pushes Latin American use of multilateralism and EU use of multilateralism sometimes in incompatible directions. Normally, you'd assume, well, engaging with multilateralism is about arriving at consensuses about through finding a peaceful, negotiated way of settling differences. But in a context of a security threat, as Europe has in the moment, I, I think different usages come to the fore. For Latin American countries and for a long time also for the EU, one of the standard uses of multilateral arenas was as a weapon of the weak. We will weave a web of norms so that the strong are less able to act unilaterally, there will be predictability, and among other things, the use of force will be less and less resorted to, conceivable, be more onerous to do. Latin America is still on that page. That's still something that we do when we engage the DGE, the OEWD, and for obvious reason, that's something Europe no longer can do. So there is a fundamental difference with regard to what they resort to multilateral decision making, and which is not about having more restraints on the use of force because they find themselves in a position where they must use the lethal instruments. So we have recently several European countries pulling out of the anti-landmine treaty. So for obvious reasons, they cannot remain on the same page as Latin America can. And this creates a lot of the misperception on whether both can remain more or less on the same wavelength moving forward. The part of the misperceptions because of, I would say, the inertia from identities. So you just continue to look at how people were and project that they'll continue to correspond. And this might relate, a lot might get lost in translation as you see where the partner is heading now. So yeah, in a nutshell, I'll put that the different security environment has made multilateralism mean different things for those two regions.
Thank you, Rafael.
I'm not an expert with this topic, so I could endorse like leave the marks.
So we can continue with the second round of questions. So we start with Kai and then Hilke and then a couple.
My name is Kai. I'm a student in the 68th semester in international relations here. My question is for Louisa. How do you see the increasing use of AI in drones and other military applications interacting with states' ability to comply with new conventions, combatant, non-combatant distinction?
Today's project coordinator of Insured, a massive university. I thought this was a fascinating panel where I learned once again a lot. And I think a lot of you have been discussing at the global level, including all the working group, AI work towards the UN. Cyber was mentioned. I'm wondering here whether we're not mistaking, and we all do that, right? In studying global governance, essentially process for substance. It strikes me, I think, Rafael made comments on the 7 biggest companies having was due there. Yeah, exactly. Seven biggest companies have the same GDP as the EU. I think what we're seeing in type of Europe, American states, negotiations. I think we're going to see that even more so in the field of digital II. Is that the EU is going to have to give in to American pressures. There, despite having quite unilateral type of format. I think the bubble here is important as well. I think it's not just 7 companies, it's also all our pension funds, right? Are investing in benefiting from which tremendous amount of growth. So they're much deeper in. But what I wanted to hear your views on in the respect, I've had more regional plans to engage with digital. And one of the reports, the SURE project, is on the Council of Europe AI convention. The only leading binding international instrument on artificial intelligence negotiated by the EU as part of the Council of Europe, the US under Biden, very much part of that. It's now open for ratification. We'll see how far it goes. But can you reflect a little bit more on, in that sense, of that regional governance in this digital field, and sort of a race between different regions trying to shield themselves from some of these digital practices through those type of things?
Hi, Marcel Capucci from professor here. I wouldn't be so alarmist about cryptocurrencies, because if you think about the total amount of capitalization that we have with cryptocurrencies, this is 1% of the global assets. It's like 3.5 trillion, where other assets would entail more than 1,250 trillion dollars. So I think a bubble is inevitable, but I wouldn't be so concerned about the effect of that in the global economy. On the other hand, I think since Bitcoins were launched, took knowledge of this amazing technology of blockchain and the amazing possibilities we have with that technology. Since art certificates to the very possibility of transaction or financial transaction like we have in Brazil Pix. So in one aspect, I'd like to have your takes and the possibility of inclusion, of social inclusion with, I wouldn't say cryptocurrencies, but at least with the digital currencies of central bank digital currencies. How could we really use that for social inclusion? We had that experience here during pandemic, because when the government was about to give money to the poor people, they didn't have accounts. So that was a possibility. That was something that could really make social inclusion. On the other hand, this cryptocurrencies were launched with possibility also of being means of payment. We have some friendly crypto cities like Tokyo, San Francisco, even Buenos Aires. However, this is like, again, 95% of the use of cryptocurrencies are in speculation. It's not for the payment, means of payment. So when we see this effort of many countries in developing a central bank digital currency, like China, like Brazil, like even Curacao has a $10, whatever. So my point here is, isn't it also a moment for us to think about how this central bank digital currencies can establish new monetary areas in the world and in some way affect dollar hegemony?
Thank you very much. I think let's start with Matteo on the right this time, and maybe we just go in order.
So thank you very much. Well, I agree with you. Right now, the crypto bubble, because I believe it's a bubble, at least if we talk about the unbacked crypto like Bitcoin, is not so big. We will have a problem if this bubble continues to play. And if the Trump administration continues on this path, I believe it's possible that this bubble will continue to play. So for the moment, the situation is not so concerning, but in the foreseeable future, it can become concerning. And likewise, it can become concerning even considering stablecoin, because it is of the utmost importance that stablecoin issuer invest their reserve in safe assets. The MiCA regulation takes into account this aspect. The Genius Act takes into account this aspect, but the supervision envisioned by the Genius Act is quite low. So I agree with you regarding blockchain. I want to quote Jamie Dimon on this. Jamie Dimon was, at least until the Trump re-election, against crypto. But he said, okay, crypto is a thing, blockchain is another. So blockchain is something positive that was brought to the surface thanks to the crypto. So something positive came thanks to crypto. Talking about central bank digital currencies, how can it foster social inclusion? I'll give you one example. In Italy, in Europe, it is really difficult for a person who had a difficult path as debtor to open a bank account. If you give to a person, even a person who has a difficult negative crediting rate, the possibility to open a bank account with the central bank digital currency, then you facilitate social inclusion. Likewise, if you consider, for example, the European scenario, we can facilitate the social inclusion because right now all our payment infrastructure are foreign payment infrastructure. There are Chinese payment infrastructure and there are mainly American infrastructure. So to a certain extent, we can be blackmailed by foreigners. If we could have struggles regarding any kind of issue. So if we have, for example, Europe, a digital euro, then we have a truly European infrastructure that can be used by citizens and consumers and the merchants in order to carry out their activities. Your last point, can CBDCs create a new monetary area? Yes, they can. They can. And I believe that China is investing massively on its central bank digital currencies for this reason. For this reason, China wants to erode the dollar dominance, even using digital renminbi, and giving the possibility to Brazil, to Russia, to India to make transactions with digital renminbi. Okay, we could also talk, for example, about the Bridge project. Okay, the Bridge project is an important project, and I believe it was conceived in order to elude Western sanctions and in order to reinforce the financial link between BRICS and between all the countries that want to operate outside the dollar system. Okay, so I hope to have answered to your question.
So there's one thing that we always say is that with the, when you're studying digital cooperation and digital technology, the law always choose low, right? And corporations always choose low as well. And I was thinking that in terms of the experience that we have in Brazil, on the one hand, we have had strong answers by the government to certain activities of the big techs, but it's always it's always a case by case, right? It's always case by case. And one recent event was very important, I think, which was the term of adjustment that was elaborated for Starlink, because the introduction of Starlink in the Amazon region was a very strategic move, and for a while that could have gone very wrong. It was an important introduction to a certain point because there was no access, and I think this needs to be read with this analyzed with complexity and nuance, because there was really no access in certain areas, etc. But of course, it was it's a sensitive issue, and it's also strategic. And but the answer was a term of adjustment with the and so, but the answers that we have had are case by case. And what I feel has been also important is the answer provided by civil society in many cases. But I even find that have been very strong regional responses in that sense.
Also not with regards to AI, but I mean, there are frameworks, such as the Inter-American one, IOAM, which intended to harmonize the implementation of national AI policies. I think that Argentina and Brazil implemented there based on this framework, but for example, Chile didn't because its AI policy comes from 2021 and the framework is from 2024. So, and therefore, the calls in both the Montevideo Declaration and the Santiago Declaration for further concerted action in Latin America. It has been quite, I mean, I think of Brazil, we have more talks with the BRICS now than with our own neighbors. So this is a huge issue. Hi, your question. It actually led me back to the you know that Portuguese we have pataquada, I don't know what some this is in English, but that kind of proposal, funny proposal that Microsoft made in 2017 on the Digital Geneva Convention. They proposed a Digital Geneva Convention to protect civilians against cyber attacks. But of course, they were trying to protect Microsoft Windows system from state intrusion. But I was thinking about, I'm gonna answer your question, but just made me think about the interest and the potential that companies have to push for increasingly to push for policies in the tech sector, and how this could be interesting to capitalize or to consider when thinking about how to protect civilians from the very systems that these companies develop. Not only states, because we're talking, of course, my own presentation was focused on states, but we know that there are some other actors who have been relevant here in global governance that sometimes we do not mention, or we do not consider as global governance actors, and of course these companies are in touch. But now to answer your question, I think that AI, if I were to be an advocate of the devil, I would say that AI operates within a legal gray zone, not gray zone, but you know, the flexibility when you have to interpret a legal concept. And I think that AI operates there with regards to the Geneva Convention, specifically because, to take again the example from Lavender, it could be argued that you were targeting Hamas people, and who else is affected is collateral damage. And I think that collateral damage is one of the most problematic concepts with regards to military operations in general, exactly because it pretends that it has no intention to kill when it does. So I would say that AI would provide some ammunition to play with these legal interpretations at the same time that it violates terribly the Geneva Convention. And then you made me think that, back to the question that Clara posed, that maybe going back to the Geneva Convention would be an interesting way of thinking about the role of, or the harms that AI is doing in the context of the two conflicts that I've been discussing. Yeah, not sure if I answered your question, but.
So just a small comment, as Luisa and Isabel have already highlighted the issue that the regional layer to AI and tech governance is relatively thin. Just a few elements on that. Many might have read already the book by Bradford, Digital Empires, in which he compares the regulatory effects of EU, China, and the US. And from the three, what she calls empires, only one is the region, the Europe for that effect. For the rest, EU and China as standard setters for tech diplomacy. It poses a few questions on the design of the governance structure worldwide. I would point out that in contrast to other policy areas that might remain static, because AI is a fast-moving field, you have first mover advantages. Therefore, if individual countries, ecosystems of innovation already occupy this place with high performance, then they have a disproportionate advantage in exporting their standards in how this will be implemented worldwide. Well, that being said, this sort of favors a penetration of the regional level by individual states, individual exporters of technology, prior to regions reaching critical capacity so that they would negotiate, let's say, on a regional level. So that is conducive to a sort of hub and spoke layout or dynamic for the overall governance. Those are my two things from the issue.
I think Hilke had a follow-up question.
Very small follow-up. So on the Council of Europe AI Convention, it's interesting. Not just Council of Europe membership, Uruguay, September signed the AI Convention. So I don't know whether, we should have a longer conversation on this, but I would also be interested to know whether perhaps other Latin American countries could sign on to this convention. The Council of Europe has a number of other conventions that are also near universal, essentially. And I think this really speaks to the first mover advantage, the type of regulatory approach we will roll out.
Somebody.
Yeah, I can come back on that point. Also, this is an interesting insight because also within Latin America, you see on the multilateral level some heterogeneity with regard to the position of individual states. So the plot is no longer there, but you would be able to see that some countries like Paraguay, Mexico, in contrast to the rest, the larger numbers of Latin America, they tend to draw closer to European positions at the UN than Brazil, Argentina. Or Chile also moves fairly close. So there is some variation within the band, which would allow for this sort of splinter behavior. But going back to my first mover argument, still it shows that the incentive, the indication for this sort of behavior arises from the fact that given that there is a first mover, there is an incentive for them to reach out or have open doors for individual countries from the regions to act on their own and exceed instead of elaborating a region-wide position on this.
I think it would be interesting to do research comparing possibilities around what you just suggested with how strong the discourse around data sovereignty is for the different countries in Latin America. Because for instance, for Brazil, this is very important. With a very strong discourse, especially because of its leadership with the G20 and the BRICS. And so I think that wouldn't necessarily play similarly with the different countries in Latin America. But that's perhaps one point of comparison.
Thank you. We also, Luisa had a question.
It's a very brief one, Rafael. Yeah. It's just a curiosity whether you have in this paper that is published or in previous or current research, whether you have considered, since we were talking about private actors earlier, the role of these companies that you mentioned in shaping in shaping the positions or influencing the positions that EU or Latin American countries have been adopting with regards to topics related to the governance or regulation of technology, and or whether this has an impact on the trends of convergence and divergence.
Sadly, to be a short answer, I haven't looked into that, but it would be very interesting to try to draw that correlation. Because again, the ecosystems are quite different. And the degree of cohesion that you see in European statements is also very puzzling. It's something that merits attention, and whether or not companies could be a hidden variable playing some role. But unfortunately, we couldn't roll that into the analysis.
Okay, do we have other questions from the audience? Yes, in the back.
Hi, my name is Leonardo. I think last week there was a report from Reuters that the Trump family made about 800 million dollars last year or since 2025, mostly due to their crypto forward initiative. And I understand that that may be related to maybe under U.S. jurisdiction, but some of that money seems to have been raised by Chinese entrepreneurs, but also other foreign investors. And my question is, at which point that falls under U.S. jurisdiction, and at which point that goes beyond, and it's something that should be regulated through other bodies like the EU or some other bodies who should be managing that those type of transactions that are cross borders like cryptocurrency.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Yeah, Rafael?
Also one for Matteo on. So one of the points that the cyber diplomacy literature makes is that some areas they remain inert, developed naturally by the tech people building it up until states realize they have a security state on it, and they must colonize that policy state with their policy people. So that's part of the argument of why you need a word for cyber diplomacy, because then on cyber states you no longer have only tech people working on it, the diplomats are taking a stake. Now, with crypto, which is not my area, so this is why I'm putting the question. Do we see a transition to a re-Westphalization, so Westphalian values coming into crypto, or is that still like a post-Westphalian power going out of the state figure in the way that it is negotiated?
Okay, so two challenging questions. Start from the one regarding track. Well, I don't know exactly Trump's wallet, how it is composed, and the kind of operation transaction that he has carried out. But you touched an important point. We're talking about payments and assets which are really difficult to locate from a geographical point of view. And this is the reason why it would be of the utmost importance of having multilateral regulation regarding crypto, because through multilateral regulation, you are capable of closing these loopholes. So this is my impression, maybe I'm wrong. I think that Trump has an interest to undermine multilateral regulation regarding crypto because he has an interest to maintain these loopholes. So this is what I want to tell you. Talking about the jurisdiction, America, Hong Kong, I don't know what kind of transaction specifically Trump has done. Trump or his son, because I know that his son is the man in charge of this important part of his business. But this is I believe your question clearly underlines the reason why they look at regulation, because otherwise it is sufficient using a VPN, and you can transact digital currencies and put in the country which has to follow the money. Well, I come to your question. That's a good question. So I would like to tell you this. I believe that regarding crypto, state for such a long time thought about crypto as a niche domain. Sooner or later, it would have disappeared. Then year after years, it became clear that the crypto were there to remain. According to my view, it is due to the fact that crypto, particularly unbacked crypto, are like gambling. So we always have gambling, and we will always have gambling. So coming to your question, why countries do that regarding crypto? Well, I believe that the most important fact that bring countries to do something is the fact that they feel their monetary sovereignty under threat. And we are talking about a sector, a domain that has historically been under the control of the state. We're talking about the money. Okay. So to a certain extent, I believe that right now it is almost impossible for a state that won't maintain a control over their economy to do something regarding crypto. So post-Westphalian, pre-Westphalian, I don't go in this details because I'm not a crypto scientist. So I leave it to you and to your evaluation. But I believe that this is an important issue for state. The states see a domain in which they have historically a monopoly, which becomes under threat. And I believe that this is the main reason why state has started to act. So this is my answer. I know that I didn't fully answer to your question, but I'm not a political scientist. I try to do my best.
Okay, so in that case, that leaves me with wanting to thank 3 times. The first thank you is to all the panelists and their fantastic insights that provided us in the last hour and a half, and really all the panelists that have spoken over the last 2 days. The second thank you is to Clara Weinhardt and Hilke Dijkstra, who coordinates the Insured project and the network that sort of made this event possible, but also the larger research project for the last couple of years, and really work tirelessly to keeping us all on track and allowing us to have these very interesting exchanges on global governance and multilateralism. And finally, to Kai and all the help for people that were with us the last 2 days. This was really a fantastically organized workshop. And I think I can speak for all of the guests that we had a really fantastic time with really interesting insights. So thank you, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.